Welcome. Today we're going to discuss the technique blinding sacrifice and how to relate it to other elements of the American Kenpo system. Now keep in mind that this is not designed to be a full comprehensive list, it's far from it, and it's not family groupings. So rather, it's just different ways to understand and explore the structure of the American Kenpo system. So if you've seen some of our previous videos, you'd understand that this technique is not an actual self-defense technique, but rather just a series of basics put together for category completion. So let's do our relationship through that category of singles and doubles. So let's start out with the base maneuver. If you notice what we're doing here is we're doing this double block. The interesting thing to notice is that we're using the outside of the forearms, but we could have just as easily done it with the inside of the forearms, which is actually demonstrated in the middle of the technique. But we'll get back into that after we do the other offensive maneuvers here. So let's look at the heel pump. If you notice, what we're doing is a double heel pump strike. But in this case, our fingers are pointing down. So let's look at this from a second person's perspective and flip the hands over. This would be any time that we're doing an attack with a push. So if you notice, all we did is change it from a low zone with our fingers pointing down to a high zone with our fingers pointing up. But again, this picks up the double. So can we do the single versions for that? Well, yeah, if you look at one of our techniques like trigger salute, we're doing the right hand. Or if we take this into something like clutching feathers, we can now do the left hand, but notice the interesting thing. We use the rear hand rather than the front hand. So let's continue through the technique. In this case, the double back knuckle. If you notice, we're doing the double back knuckles, but we're doing them to the low zone. But we could just as easily do them to a high zone and the single version rather than the double. This would bring in something like striking serpent's head, so we can use our left, or even something like twirling hammers, where we're now using the right. But just like the heel pump, I can also invert my hand. So rather than having my thumb down, I can have my thumb up. And this can give us something like reversing mace, where we're using our back knuckle to the outside from their left side, or something like trigger salute, where we're now doing it from the inside, but still hitting to the outside. So now that we talked about the back knuckles, let's get back into these blocks. Like I mentioned earlier, we had the double blocks using the outside of the forearms, and then the double blocks using the inside of the forearms. So let's start with the inside of the forearms and do the single versions. And this is shown in the same technique with both hands. In this case, unfurling crane, where we pick up the one hand and then pick up the second hand. So let's go back to the outside of the forearms. Well, this could be something as simple as delayed sword or even sword of destruction. But keep in mind that just like we can do it single, we can also start changing the timing. So we could do something like snaking talent, where we're doing them one followed by the other, or even something like entwined maces or fatal deviation could still pick up those blocks as well. So now that we did the blocks, let's move into our slices. So if you notice, the follow-up maneuver would be this double slices. Well, if we take this into something like protecting fans, where we can get to here, we can start doing the single version. But notice the interesting thing. We're doing the single version, but then, just like we've been doing, flipping the hand over so we can do it palm up rather than palm down. But just like we can do it with one hand, if we go to the end of fatal deviation, we can now do it sequentially, where we do one hand followed by the other. And again, in this case, using the left followed by the right. So now that we did the slices, let's talk about these frictional pulls that we're doing on a vertical. So if you notice, we got the hands here, and we do this frictional pull. Well, we can do a horizontal version of that. That would give something like hooking wings, where we're now doing them but on a horizontal rather than on a vertical. But notice that again, they're still double. So can we do single versions? Well, yeah, if we do something like Dance of Darkness, where we get behind them, we can do the single version with the right hand from behind, or we can move it to the front, do something like Circles of Protection, where we're now doing it with the left hand. But notice the interesting thing. We're doing it in a circular manner rather than a linear manner. But let's continue going on that horizontal and do the single version, something like Snap and Quick, where we're now doing that frictional pull with the right. But keep in mind that we could also do the opposite. Rather than doing a frictional pull, we can do a frictional push. This would give us something like Glancing Spear, where we're now doing that push rather than the pull. But let's continue. What's the follow-up maneuver here? We do this inverted vertical roundhouse. We're doing two of them. So in blinding sacrifice, we do the double. Where do we do the single? Well, this would be something like Escape from Darkness, where we kneel them down, we control them, and then we do this punch on a downward trajectory rather than upward. But keep in mind, just like we've been doing on all the other parts where we can invert the hand, we can also invert this so that it's thumb up rather than thumb down. And this will give us something like cross of death when we get to the end where we do that roundhouse, but we add that diversified angle of retraction. So now let's talk about the last sequence of the technique because it's actually very unique to the technique. And we'll get into that as we get into it. So let's look at the grab. If you notice, what we're doing is using two of our hands to pull them into the knee. So this is where we get the double because we're moving both our hands and our knee at the same time. Well, this is done on a vertical. If we look at something like glancing salute, we are doing the horizontal version using only one hand rather than both hands to do the push and the pull with the hand and the knee. But this also has the concept of bringing the weapon to the target and target to the weapon. So if we looked at something like backbreaker, we're actually demonstrating both, where I'm bringing the weapon to the target and the target to the weapon to demonstrate both knees. But this is going to bring us into that final maneuver, which is the stump. But if you notice something about the stump, well, they're single. They're not done double. So why are they part of the category? Well, because we need to establish our base, right? As rule number one, we need to have a base, so we can't really do the double stumps. Or can we? Well, yeah, notice what I just said. We needed a base. But what if I don't need a base? What if my opponent was on the ground? We do something like leap of death, where we take the opponent to the ground, and I no longer need to establish my base, but rather I can do it through the strike. So I'm going to establish my base while doing double of our stomps. But the interesting thing to keep in mind here is that we're also doing the double heel pump, but rather than on a horizontal, we're now doing it on a vertical. And then, just like we talked about the pull with the knee, we can now do the double version of the knee, and rather than pulling down with both hands, we're lifting up with both hands. So, to recap, the way that we just related blinding sacrifice to other elements of the American Kenpo system was by breaking down each individual piece of the technique and showing you how it fits into the category completion concept. We hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system a little bit better. Thank you very much.